In this lesson, we're going to learn how to manage input streams from the console primarily. In fact, completely from the console. The simplest way to manage an input stream, and the way we've seen before, is using cin. So let's begin by looking at that kind of as a review. So we're going to prompt the user to enter their name, and when they enter their name, we're going to use the cin and the insertion or getFrom operator to store the user's response in the variable. So let's run that. And then we recognize there's a problem when the user enters the first name and the last name, because cin takes the space as a delimiter and only retrieves the first part up to the space, George, into the variable. So the solution to that problem is to use the member function getLine, like so. Let's build and run. Now we're able to store as much data with spaces in it as we want into the variable, because getLine is now looking for a carriage return line feed or a new line as a delimiter to stop input. So it's important to know that cin works fine for single word input, whether it be numbers or strings, as long as you don't want a space in between them. In strings, when you need a space, then you have to switch to getLine. And as long as you keep that straight, working with input streams from the console are quite simple to understand. Now let's look at one more possibility that we haven't talked about before, and that's getting character input from the keyboard. We can do that using a function called get. Get will retrieve a single character from the keyboard and store it in a char variable. And we're going to retrieve input until we get to a point where the user enters the end-of-file character, which is Control-Z. Now on Windows, you have to enter that twice to make it work correctly, as you'll see. So here's what we're doing. Let's look at the program one more time. We declare a char variable. We get a character from the keyboard. We've seen cout.put before. That puts the character to our standard output, to the console. Then we get another character in using cin.get, and we just continue in the loop while the character that we're getting is not the end-of-file character. Now, let's watch how that works in practice. Now, there's no prompt, so we're simply entering data. So we'll type in the name George again. Notice that it keeps running, and we can type as much as we want. Then when we're finished, we're going to hit Control-Z and Control-Z again, and that takes us out of the program. Very rarely do you actually need to get character input. Remember, this is kind of a leftover from the days of C when strings were stored as char arrays. But there are situations where you might want to use that fine of a input device, so it is available to you. But I would suggest for most user input, cin and getLine will work just fine. So that wraps up this lesson on managing console-based input. Now we're ready to move to the next lesson where we're going to talk about string streams. That's S-T-R-I-N-G, streams. And we're going to see some practical uses for those when we want to mix numbers and strings in the same output, such as a return statement from a function. So we'll see how to work with string streams in the next lesson.